Begin? Well, I will. What I want to do this morning is to talk about ritual, but I want to briefly recap one or two points I made last week. Just so that you follow the argument and follow the connections. I was talking, was it last week? I'm lost. Yes, it was Friday, wasn't it? I was talking about culture, and I was trying to explain that the notion of culture is highly ambiguous, and it's really ambiguous, I think, in three principal ways. It's ambiguous because there's an ambiguity about its relationship to nature. It's defined sometimes in relation to nature, and yet in all respects that the boundaries between nature and culture are ambiguous. Our very idea of nature is itself cultural. It's not something which is shared by other societies, etc. So that's one of the ambiguities, is that culture is defined in contradistinction to nature, and yet nature is itself paradoxically cultural. The second one is that there's an ambiguity between the idea of culture as high culture, Tate Modern and all that stuff, versus culture as something which everybody has. And that I want to come back to that point in a moment, because you will see that this distinction between high culture and culture everywhere is mirrored in the distinction between, or some of the distinctions between, ritual and ordinary life. And I want to point out that it's actually rather difficult to tell what ritual is, and that our notions of ritual are rather similar to our notions of high culture. And the third ambiguity had to do with the point that culture is paradoxically something which both everybody has, which unites them, but also paradoxically divides them into specific regional groupings, apparently divides them in this way. And I briefly at the end of my lecture pointed out that functionalism and structuralism operate from both opposite ends, that functionalism starts by assuming that everybody is the same, i.e. that we're all endowed with the same capacities, but ends up by effectively showing that we're all different because we're all categorized out into different units. While structuralism takes the opposite tack and says that the real problem is really to demonstrate the underlying similarity. Now, neither of these, and it's very important that you keep this in mind, that it's not correct to view anthropological or sociological theories as trainer fashions. Prada trainers are out this year or in this year, or skirt lengths or football teams. It's not the case that one theory is dead and that by some inexorable progress of wisdom it's overthrown by another theory, etc. That in fact these theories are simply ways of handling data. For all the bricks and everything else that people throw at functionalism, if you imagined yourself doing anthropological fieldwork and producing a description of another society or another culture, you couldn't help to be functionalist in certain senses. And structuralism as a grand theory, and I'll come back to this point in a moment, is probably mistaken in certain respects. But insofar as structuralism looks for patterns in data, then everybody is a structuralist, whether they like it or not. So that be careful of the kind of football team view of theory. Now, if functionalism took its model from the natural sciences, and particularly the idea of bounded bodies, with all the problems, once you start applying this to cultures, the problems that raises in terms of imagining that cultures are like human species, or species of animals, vanishing cultures. If you go into Heifers, you will see umpteen books on the last tribal peoples, and very often they're associated with jungles. So we see threatened species being merged with threatened tribes. So this idea that tribes and species are like one another, it seems to attract attention, seems an attractive idea, but yet if you think about it, it's actually a very, very dangerous idea. Now, what The structuralism's basic idea is that instead of taking the model, a natural science model, it happened to take its cues, its models from the study of linguistics. And it did so because in the 60s and 70s, language or linguistics seemed to be making very rapid advances, and because linguistics seemed to be the most precise and scientific of the social sciences. And what he was saying was that if we think of language it has a sort of a double form. On the one hand, language is speech, which is stuff out there, you can hear it or observe it. But on the other hand, language is something which is apparently the product of something behind language, which is grammar, so that we have both we have something out there produced and something which seems to lie behind it, which is generating the stuff that we see or hear. And one of the points that structuralism tried to do was say, well, maybe we can get to some kind of grammar of culture. Maybe we can get behind the surface differences and look at the underlying similarities by getting to what produces culture. What is it in the mind which generates culture, rather than looking at the manifestations of culture themselves. And their second point was that they got excited because of the fact that linguistics seemed to offer a possibility of some kind of way of universalizing diversity, that behind all the diversity of different languages, they all seem to work in the same way, and they work basically by contrasts between sounds. So the structuralist idea was, well, maybe we can generate meaning systems. Maybe culture is a meaning system that operates by contrasts between things, cultural elements. And if we take, and I gave you an example of college scarves, or college paddles, rowing paddles. The system is actually a coding system. It isn't, in this case, it doesn't operate as a symbol system. It's not a system of meaning, it's a system of coding. In other words, the reason why Downing wears this kind of muddy red colour is not because muddy red connotes something to people in Downing, like the fact that for us brides wearing white connotes purity, etc. It's simply that the difference between this colour, this colour, this colour is made into an analogous series with the differences of colleges. So here we have an example in which differences in one domain, coloured blades, are being used to signal differences in another. Colleges, like differences in sounds in language, are being used to signal differences in meaning. Now, the useful points about structuralism, each one you gain some, you lose some. One of the strong points about it is it does enable us to think cross-culturally and to see that behind the superficial differences, similar patterns of thought are operating. So that I hope you can understand that the logic of all this is rather like the logic of traffic lights. Do you understand that the contrast between lights are signaling a contrastive set of behavioral actions? The difference between red and green is the difference between stopping and going. It's probably not arbitrary, of course, that they chose red for the danger and green for the go, so that there is a certain amount of sedimented meaning in the traffic lights. I'm not going to do this today, but in another lecture I want to show you that the logic behind what is called totemism, which is conventionally understood as the worship of animals, in certain respects operates exactly like the logic of college colours. So that here we have an example in which we can take two very different systems of symbolization or coding, one from Australia or Amazonia, the other from Cambridge colleges, and show that behind the differences we have a common way of thinking, so that we're moving up from cultural particularities to general comparisons. In other words, structuralism seems to offer a way of getting above and beyond cultural particularities and bounded units. It also, and this is another point that I want to elaborate in these lectures, it points up the distinctions between points up the problems of trying to make distinctions between religion and ordinary life, rational, irrational, etc. And that's a point I want to develop today. But it has certain problems. The first one is that if you think about it, the idea that cultures are like grammars is highly problematic for two reasons. The first reason is that actually cultures don't boss you around. It's the idea that we follow rules in culture is rather problematic, because it would be probably better to think of cultures not as a set of rules which we obey as kind of automata, but as it's better to see it as culture or cultural ideas, elements, as resources which we can use according to certain conventions, which we can, if we wish, break. So that we're not absolutely constrained by rules. And the second point, if you follow this, is that we tend, some people, particularly when they write sniffy letters to the BBC about how people are breaking grammatical rules, we think, so here they're saying, well, people aren't following the rules, but in fact what happens in grammars is that it isn't the case that the grammars pre-exist the behavior. What actually happens is that people, if you had to write a grammar of an unwritten language, what you do is you watch people's behavior, and from that behavior you construct a kind of model which accounts for the regularities in that behavior, so that in fact the procedure goes from the behavior to the grammar and not from the grammar to the behavior. But of course it's actually circular, because in part you have the grammar which every time now that I'm speaking, to some extent I'm following the rules of English grammar, but not all of my sentence will be properly grammatical. So on the one hand, grammar is my knowledge of these implicit conventions in my head is constraining my behavior to some extent, but at the same time that behavior is actually altering linguistic patterns. So that if we take the example of gay, my mother still thinks it's sort of happy and jolly and all the rest of it, and her grandchildren titter every time she says, oh, we did have a gay occasion, didn't we? And she says, no, it doesn't mean that. You're wrong. It's grammatically wrong. Gay doesn't mean homosexual. Gay means happy. But it's not the case that it means what people use it to mean, so that the system is changing. Most undergraduates today talk about, they use the word disinterested as if it meant, to me, disinterested means without an axe to grind, whilst uninterested means bored. But an awful lot of people today don't make that distinction. So that, and it's no good me saying, well, disinterested doesn't mean bored or uninterested. It's simply that the word has now changed its meaning. So that it isn't simply the case that rules produce behavior, behavior also modifies cultural conventions. Well, we'll come back to these points later on. The third problem, and this I will store up to for my very last lecture, is that the underlying proposition of structuralism is that because we all think in the same way, then there is something similar about all human cultural productions. But the problem with structuralism is that they have a rather bad model of how people think. In other words, there's something wrong with the theory of cognition. The structuralist theory of cognition is that people think like computers, i.e. in binary, on-off, plus-minus, binary opposition systems, and the evidence suggests that that isn't necessarily the case, but I shall return to that much later. Okay, so now let's move on to ritual. Now what I want to do in talking about ritual is really to make 3 points. The first one is very obvious indeed, which is that our notion of culture has strong affinities with our notion of ritual. My second point is that there is, in a sense, the ambiguity between culture as high culture versus culture as what everybody has is reproduced in people's attempts to define ritual. So that poses the question, what is ritual? Rather like I've asked the question, what is cultural? And the third point I want to make, and I halfway through this lecture I shall change gear, my third point is that a particular kind of ritual called rites of passage have been used. Not only are rites of passage of cultural interest in themselves, but they have been used as a model for thinking about other aspects of culture. So I want to go through these 3 points in turn. Now I hope that you can see that the affinities between the notion of high culture and ritual are fairly similar. So that very often both anthropologists and people themselves think of ritual as the quintessence of their culture. So that and this is why tourist agencies trot out folkloric dress, it's why at Olympic Games people dress up in a particular stereotyped kind of fancy dress, it's why anthropologists very often analyze ritual, it's why documentary filmmakers make films. When you see films of tribal peoples on the telly, you can bet your bottom dollar that an awful lot of it will be song and dance and fancy dress. So that for all of these reasons we see ritual as the quintessence of culture. So here's an anthropologist talking about this. This is Victor Turner, famous anthropologist who wrote about ritual. This is Turner's view of ritual. Turner says, cultures are most fully expressed in and made conscious of themselves in their ritual and theatrical performances. A performance is declarative of our shared humanity, yet it utters the uniqueness of particular cultures. So here is Turner playing with this idea of universals and difference, that everybody does ritual, but rituals signal cultural difference. Well, and I had some slides just to stop you being disinterested. Sorry. So here we have, this is rituals, exchange rituals in Highland New Guinea. This is initiation rituals in Amazonia. And this is gypsy weddings in the United States. All quite familiar, and here we have another one, but we'll come back to that one in a moment. Okay, so this is ritual. Now, fine, yes, ritual is very much culture, and culture is ritual. And remember what I told you about those Amerindians who ask the women what's their culture, because the women don't dress up as in feathers and paint. The problem is, of course, that a great deal of culture is not anything to do with ritual at all. An awful lot of ritual is just taken for granted. Just as an experiment, I won't ask you to do it, but in your heads, ask your neighbour first to borrow 50p, and then ask them to borrow £500, and I can tell you that you will come up, in each case, with fairly standard routines. Hey, can I borrow 50p? Or, I'm awfully sorry, I've never met you before, and I promise I've got lots of money in my bank account, but and I've just got a problem about my grant check this week, but please, could we meet afterwards? You know how to do these things. You're very clever cultural manipulators. You know the rules about sponging, and you know how to sponge in different ways for different amounts with different peoples. But there's nothing in grammar which tells you that. Nothing, you never find in English grammar instructions on how to sponge money, nor would most people call this culture, and yet it's very much part of your culture. So that a lot of culture is tacit, taken for granted things which you produce miraculously without even knowing you're doing it. Okay, so that's my first point, is simply that there are affinities between people's everyday notion of culture and their everyday idea about ritual, but they're somewhat problematic. The second point I want to make is really what is ritual. And this is really a matter of on the one hand, a problem from ordinary behavior. Is ritual special behavior which is marked out by religion or sacredness, or is it an aspect of ordinary behavior? Or is it something which is marked off from rational behavior, science? And there's been a vast amount of anthropological and indeed sociological literature spilt on this, or written about this particular topic. But we can divide the arguments into really three main sections. On the one hand, there are those who feel that ritual is a kind of magic, which we could call bad or mistaken science, irrational. It's irrational. It doesn't work, but some idiots think it does work. Then there's the view that ritual is about symbols, that it's not meant to work. Don't be stupid. When people do ritual, they're not trying to change the state of the world at all. They're trying to change something else. And then there's the idea that ritual is expression, and I want to go through these three briefly in turn and end up with the idea of expression. So that let's begin with magic. Now, here ritual is defined as a kind of behavior which is irrational according to the observer. So that if we take the classic case which was studied by Durkheim noticed that periodically the Australian Aborigines came together and did various rituals which they said, or it is said that they said, served to increase the number of animal species. Now, of course, we know, because we're clever, that it's bloody stupid to do that sort of thing, because rituals don't make any damn difference to the number of kangaroos or wallabies in the desert. So that implicitly there's an idea that some people are better than others, that anthropologists kind of stand back, or sociologists stand back and say, well, of course other people are stupid, but we can understand that given their poor state of mental development, they might be stupid. So that here's an example. Here are two examples of this. This is the sort of view that Sir James Fraser, who wrote The Golden Bough, took about ritual. Ritual was simply bad science. It was magic. Here's a more modern view, somebody called Horton, it doesn't matter what his name was. He says, ritual is like magic. It's a means of acting on the world, bringing about and controlling things. Or there's another one called Jack Goody, who used to teach me. Ritual is non-rational behavior in which the relation between means and ends is non-intrinsic or not self-evident. So here are two people, Horton and Goody, both of who see ritual as a special kind of behavior which is effectively bad or mistaken science. Now, one of the problems here is that it assumes that the Australian Aborigines, the fact that the Australian Aborigines say that their rituals are designed to keep the world going or increase animal species, there's a translation problem as to precisely what they mean. They may not mean that it's designed to do this in the same technological way that they do things when they cook. And if you think about your own lives, you do quite a lot of things which are kind of a good thing to do because they're conventionally appropriate or because they're religiously appropriate, but you wouldn't confuse those with technology and science. So some of you might ask for blessings at church, but you would still make sure that you drove carefully on the motorway to Manchester. You wouldn't confuse the two. One is the complement of the other. They're not the same thing. Another problem is obviously that we found already in my examples of eel traps and aeroplanes that quite ordinary things seem to have magical technical aspects, so that even in the rationality of the world of aviation, magic or something, symbolism, seems to be operating. And finally, it's quite clear that not all ritual is obviously magical at all. So that if you take the Catholic version of the Mass, is in a sense much more magical than the Protestant version of Eucharist, because in the Catholic version, it involves a magical act of transubstantiation. The blood, the wine really does become blood, and the bread really does become flesh. Whilst in the Protestant version, these are merely symbolic statements. So that, but neither the Protestants nor the Catholics would confuse this with technology. So that's one view of ritual, ritual as a special kind of practical activity. Now, Durkheim himself took a quite different view of Australian Aboriginal ritual. Durkheim's view was that Durkheim distinguished between what looked like the function. The function of the rituals looked like the increase of animal species, but Durkheim said no, that's not what is happening at all, because ritual is not ordinary behavior. We know when something is ritual because ritual belongs to the domain of the sacred, which is quite different from the domain of the profane. So that sacredness has to do with religion and ritual, and is always, according to Durkheim, marked off from profane, rational, technical activities like hunting and gathering. So this was his key model for what is ritual. Ritual is sacred behavior, not ordinary behavior. In other words, it's a categorically different kind of behavior. And what he said was that the aim of Australian Aboriginal religion and ritual, and by extension of all human religion and ritual, wasn't to alter the state of the world, but to alter the state of society. The idea was that by engaging in ritualistic acts, you altered people's way of thinking and feeling so that you increased their mutual cohesion together. So that, in other words, ritual was a symbolic system, or what he called a system of collective representations, and it was the fact that they were collective which was part of the way in which the ritual served to glue people together. So that for those of you who like the royals, you might attend a ceremony of the trooping of the colour, or Lady Di and Prince Charles's wedding, which would have made you feel even more Brit and proud to be Brit, and you would have seen these symbols of the Union Jack, etc. So that here is Durkheim in action in Britain. So that ritual then both generates sentiments and reminds us of the power structure. So here we have, and this note, so that for Durkheim, what Durkheim called collective representations or symbols is very much what anthropologists call culture. So that for Durkheim, ritual and religion was the really real, and that if you wanted to find out about culture or social symbols, the place to do it was by looking at ritual. Now, again, this is fine up to a point, but just notice, again, the same problems, that there are ritualistic aspects of a lot of technological behavior, which I will come back to. What then also about ceremony? Were the May Day parades and everything else in Soviet Russia ritual or ceremony? Do they or don't they count as Durkheim's sacred? Well, technically, at least according to the Soviet power structure, they were the opposite of religion, because the Soviet Union was supposed to enter into a period of rational thought and rational culture, way away from the mystifications of religion. So that in one sense you could say that Soviet rituals were anything but rituals according to Durkheim. But on the other hand, if you look at them functionally, what they did was precisely to glorify the state and the power structure and make people cohere together. And in fact, the Soviets employed anthropologists and sociologists to design rituals, and these anthropologists and sociologists read their Durkheim and all the other texts in order to design better rituals. So that functionally they certainly were religion, but officially they were not. And those rituals, Soviet rituals, clearly point up a third problem, which is what is being represented the truth or some mystification of the truth? And the answer seems to be that it's more a mystification of the truth than the truth itself. Now, the third idea, so here we have Durkheim and a whole lot of other people, I have to say, it's not just Durkheim. The third view of ritual as some kind of expression is particularly associated with somebody called Leach, but also with many, many other anthropologists. And here is Leach's definition of ritual. Leach says that almost every human action has a technical aspect which does something and an aesthetic communicative aspect which says something. In those types of behavior labeled ritual, the aesthetic communicative aspect is particularly prominent, but a technical aspect is never entirely absent. In other words, what Leach is arguing is that the ritual is not a special category or type of behavior, but it is the expressive aspect of all behavior. And what Leach argued was that according to Leach, what is being expressed or communicated by ritual are things to do with social status, the proper social order, etc. So that what Leach views as ritual is the expressive aspect of clothing, food, etc., behavior, all sorts of behavior. Let me give you two brief examples of this. I've given you one already when I said that in my family we have a special word, tudging, which means washing up aggressively. So here is washing up. Everybody does it, but if you do it right, you can really make proud statements about how angry you are with other people by doing washing up expressively. So here's a technical aspect which conveys information. Let's take another example. If you go into the Guildhall in Cambridge, on the wall you will see a whole lot of trowels, bricklayers' trowels, made of solid silver with ivory handles, with engravings of the names of the last Lord Mayors on them. Now, what happens periodically is they got too valuable now, but in the old days, when the Lord Mayor laid a foundation stone, he would get, or the Lady Mayoress would get his or her trowel and lay a foundation stone. And if they didn't make a complete and utter balls up of the job, the foundation stone would stay in the building. So that technically the foundation stone laying a foundation stone is as much it's one more brick in the building. But if you saw a whole load of brickies up on the scaffolds, each one dressed up as Lord Mayors with chains, each waving a nice silver trowel with an ivory handle, you'd think this is very odd. So that, in other words, what is happening is that the foundation stones have a technical behavior, but they're primarily expressive. And when you see brickies laying mortar, each one, some of them flick their trowel in a gentle way as they lay the cement. Each one has their own style, so that not everything they're doing has to do with function. Some of it is technical at the same time. Another example of this would be, and this is the sort of idea that Leach liked. What Leach is saying, if we take the example of food. Now, what Leach is saying is if we take language is simply an expressive set of activities which are imposed upon the natural function of breathing. If I stopped breathing, I wouldn't be able to speak. So that by stopping and modifying a stream of air going in and out of my mouth, I can generate a system of communication and meaning. And Leach argues, well, eating is rather the same, because eating, ultimately, you eat to keep yourself alive. If you didn't eat, you would die. But what you eat, with whom, when, where, in what combinations, etc., is heavily encoded for meaning. So that if one of your fellows invited you to dinner in their college room and gave you cornflakes, you would object on all sorts of grounds. You say, not only is it bloody mean to give me cornflakes, but it's also inappropriate, because cornflakes mean morning, whilst smoked salmon or something means evening. So that encoded in your meal are systems of meaning. Where I work in Amazonia, you have to eat, the men go out hunting and fishing, and the women produce the bread. It's actually made out of manioc or cassava. And you're not allowed to eat meat or fish without manioc. So that I've been on occasions where we've been out in the forest hunting and people have got fish and they refuse to eat it. They're desperately hungry and they refuse to eat it till they've gone back home and got hold of some bread. Why? Because it's a very, very rigid rule that you don't eat meat or fish without bread. It's part of that very strong cultural convention, and part of it has to do with the fact that it's about stability of gender relations, so that the combination of fish or meat and veg is like the combination of men and women, so that the act of eating these two things together is a kind of cosmic, every meal is a cosmic meal. And we have the same thing, the fact that the British family dinner on Sundays is still roast beef, Yorkshire pudding, etc. It's got the same set of ideas latent within it. Now, and I'm going to elaborate, I'm going to come back to this point about food in a later lecture. Now, the advantage of this kind of approach is that it shows the rather artificial nature of this distinction between sacred and profane. Things aren't absolutely sacred or absolutely profane. They're simply aspects. So that ritual is something which is much bigger, that the expressive aspects of the behavior spread well beyond, or the symbolic aspects of behavior spread well beyond the domain which we might call ritual. There are problems though. The first one is really who is communicating to whom. Is it really about communication? That's the anthropologist's problem, because the anthropologist is scratching his or her head and asking, what is going on? What does this mean? But you have to remember that the anthropologist is an outsider who's trying to figure it out. The insiders are not bothering to figure it out. They're bothering about performance. They're bothering about something quite different. They're not concerned with communicating meaning. When you have a party, you're not involved in communicating messages exactly, you're involved in interaction. But an outsider might say, what does all this mean? But it doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's about doing, it's about performance. And the other point is that part of the point of all this, if it was so easy to put it all into words, why would people bother to encode it into this elaborate non-verbal form in the beginning? It was the famous question when Isadora Duncan was asked by the great ballerina, dancer, was asked by some journalist about what does her dancing mean. She said, well dear, if I could say it to you, I wouldn't be bothering to dance. So that there are limits to the idea of communication. Okay, so that's my second point, is really that I've talked about the relation between culture and ritual, and I've talked about the ambiguities, the problems about what do we mean by ritual. I now want, for the last quarter of an hour, to talk about rites of passage as a source of theoretical ideas for the study of culture. Now, what the person in question that you need to remember is somebody called Van Gennep, who was a colleague of Durkheim, a Frenchman, Van Gennep, who wrote a book called Les Rites de Passage, or the Rites of Passage. And what Van Gennep meant by rites of passage were transitions in space or time or status. So that on the one hand we have life cycle transitions, births, marriages and deaths. We also have, and so that here we have changes in group or individual status. Yeah, I don't know why we got that one. What was the next one? So then we have spatial transitions. So on the one hand we have status transitions, then we have transitions in space, moving from one place to another. And here's an example. This is the supposed British threshold ritual, that when you carry your bride over the threshold, when your bride enters the house, she mustn't walk, she must be carried. So this is an example of a threshold ritual. Greetings and partings are another example of threshold or spatial rituals. But there are all sorts of other ones which we find in different human societies. And then the third, so that he has transitions in social status, transitions in space, and transitions in time. Sorry, I shouldn't have put the... So that we have what are called calendrical rituals, of which Christmas and Carnival are two very good examples. So here's the Rio Carnival, it's just been, and So this is part of a complicated transition, which is the transition between Carnival, Lent, and Easter. And Christmas is another complex transition. Do we have any more? Yes, here's another. This is Baal Carnival. So there's some examples of Carnival for you. Now, these rites of passage have been of theoretical interest to anthropologists for two reasons. Firstly, because they do things. In other words, they function in society. They do useful social work. So that rites of passage, particularly status transitions, proclaim and legitimate new statuses. So that in the old days, unless you had been through a marriage ritual, you were not married. In other words, it did actually or have some pretty substantial differences. And if it wasn't for that ritual, there would be no change. So that, for instance, we don't have in Britain, a category of initiate men and women. Why not? Because we do not have initiation rites. But where I work in Amazonia, there is a marked male initiation rite and a rather less marked female initiation rite. And so that you refer to people as prior to initiation, they're called child, dakegi, dakego, and after initiation, they're called initiate boy or girl, mamu or mamo. So that the rituals establish the difference and legitimate that difference. And they also bring it about by a kind of enactment. So if you happen to get married, particularly in church, but even in the registry office, as Charles and Camilla are about to do, the priest or the registrar will say to Camilla and Charles things. They'll say to them that they must look after each other and cherish each other and all the rest of it. And in the church ritual, in the traditional church ritual, they'll tell you some stuff about sex. Now, it's not as if Charles and Diana don't know about sex. We all know that they do. But what happens in the ceremony is that they're being told, now this applies to you. It's important. So that the rituals, in a sense, they can change people's way of thinking. I went through initiation in Amazonia, and they said to me that if I ate chili pepper after the initiation, I would die. And I found myself having been involved. I went through a rite of 3 days, and then we have spent a month sitting in a small hut eating ants' heads and manioc bread, and subjected to various other tortures. And I can tell you, by the end of that, I tried to dare myself to eat a chili pepper, and I couldn't bring myself to do it. So that rituals really do work. They can affect the way you think. So they're quite powerful. Okay, so that's just some examples about ritual as the functions of ritual. That it proclaims status changes, it legitimates those changes, it socializes them. If you get married, you will find that although you might think it's just me and her or me and him, that mum and dad have a rather too much to say in the business, and you suddenly discover that you're not just marrying a partner, you're marrying a whole social system. You get your in-laws and all that entails. So that, in other words, the social embeddedness of the ritual is very important too. So that's the functional view. The structuralist view is that ritual is basically a boundary-forming or category-forming device. In other words, that ritual functions to establish logical or social categories. Ritual is about classification and category forming. And that by manipulating symbolic categories, we produce boundaries of a particular kind. And that it is actually the ritual itself that produces the distinctions between social states or temporal states, etc. So the argument in brief is that if you didn't have lunchtime, a special period where you pig out and sit in a cafe or do whatever you like, if it wasn't for the fact of the ritual of lunch, there would be no morning and afternoon. And by the same token, if it wasn't for the ritualization of Christmas and New Year, there would be no years. And then, of course, the Chinese put their ritual at a different time of the year, and so they have a different calendar. So here's the argument that the ritual, it is the funny behavior of the ritual which is producing the category distinctions between between social statuses, places, and times. And how they argue it is basically this: that if you look at the patterning of ritual, and here we're moving into structuralist thinking, that miraculously we have rites of passage all over the world, but they seem to be structured in the same way. And this was what Van Gennep pointed out. Van Gennep pointed out that they seem to have this common patterning, that you have, here you are in time, space, or social status A. You first go through a ritual of separation, and then you go through a ritual of sort of odd behavior, odd status, and then you go through a ritual of reincorporation into a new time, place, or social status. So that, for instance, we could say that the marriage in the UK, the marriage ceremony is the rite of separation, then the honeymoon is the rite of liminality, and then there is not a particularly marked ritual of reincorporation. One of the features that we notice about them is that logically these two are opposed. So that we see the same thing, for instance, in the pattern of Carnival and Lent. Carnival is the separation from normality, which has a mythical charter. Jesus went out into the desert, 40 days of marginality, and then came back into Jerusalem. And what do we have now? We have a ritual of Carnival where people let their hair down. Then if you're good, 40 days of no meat. This is Carnevale, bye-bye meat, in Italian and Latin. 40 days of fasting, and then you have a very uptight ceremony of Easter. So that there is a difference between that. When I was initiated in northwest Amazonia, this bit consisted of cutting our hair, painting us from head to toe with black paint, whipping us, showing us sacred flutes and trumpets, and forbidding us to have any contact with women and fire and chili peppers. Then we spent 2 months locked up in a little hut, vomiting every morning, eating ants' heads and bread, and doing all sorts of other nasty things. And then we had another coming out ceremony where we were painted from head to toe in red by women. And what did we have to do but drink hot chili juice? And we were also roasted on fire. So that you can see that the patterning operates by a series of antitheses. And notice the antitheses and you probably don't notice this, but notice the antitheses in the Carnival Lent patterning. What kind of behavior do you do here? Well, you dress up, you cross-dress, you make sort of farty noises, bangs, clatters, and all that. And then the church bells are officially muffled for 40 days. And then what happens here is you all dress up in suits or things which look rather like wedding dresses, and you go through a very formal ritual, and the church bells start ringing. So that you can see that the patterning is there, but we don't know. So look at what happens in the wedding and the wedding speech and the best man's speech. Here, the wedding speech is all serious, done by a clergyman, and is about how to regulate your sexuality, or not all about, but that's part of it. And here, the best man gives a speech where he says, "Oh, wow, she was a real goer in her life, and what was for him, I mean, Jesus, you know," and all that stuff. And then you tie whatever it is, you cover the car in lipstick and put balloons on the back and all the rest of it. So that there is a sense in which this bit is highly formal and that bit is highly informal, etc. So there seems to be some patterning here. Now, anthropologists of Leach and Mary Douglas and others got very interested in this and developed this into a thesis about what they call taboo, which is really this. So I've redrawn this diagram here. So here is state, time, place, or social status A, and here's time, place, social status B. And it's the point in between, it's this bit here, which is in fact, it's this bit here, which is the focus of special ritual behavior. It's this patterning which generates these distinctions. In other words, the ritual treatment of the overlap generates the category distinctions. Christmas generates years. Frontiers generate countries. Marriages generate married people, etc. That's the argument. So we can say that, and the argument is that, the first bit of the argument is that the ritualization, the special behavior here, generates and reinforces the category distinctions. That they are, in a sense, an outcome of the ritualization itself. We wouldn't have a New Year without Christmas. If you read your Trobriand ethnography, you will find that the Trobrianders have a ceremony called Mila Mala. And guess what the Trobrianders do on Mila Mala? The boys put on frilly petticoats and dance. Malinowski says the Pandana streamer dances are disfigured to the European taste by the custom of men wearing women's grass petticoats. So here we have the Trobriand version of carnival. So it seems to be all over the world. So that funny behavior generates categories. The second point that they're making is that the attitude to this bit here, the special bit in the middle, is that the ambiguous tone is both one of reverence, or what Durkheim called sacredness, and also fear and danger, taboo. In other words, this bit here seems to be the locus of power. Van Gennep himself thought it was that this bit was about going into the sacred. It was visiting the world of the ancestors. But we could also say that logically there's something potent about things which are neither one thing nor the other. And the third proposition is that the blurring of category distinctions is either something which you should not do because it's dangerous, so that you have various kinds of taboo which keep categories apart, and I shall come back to this. I shall talk about gypsy clothing, in which separations of trying to avoid mixtures seem to be used as a symbolic language to talk about social status. But so sometimes people are concerned to keep categories separate and distinct, but at other times people are concerned to mix categories for powerful reasons. So that, for instance, if you take the example of All Saints' Day, Halloween, here's an example in which momentarily the dead are allowed to join back to the living. And in other words, normally the dead are kept separate from the living, but under certain ritual occasions the dead come back to the living. And that patterning, which is much more dramatic in Mexico and Dia de los Muertos, is this patterning of merging boundaries for potent effects is a very standard pattern throughout the world. So that sometimes people merge. So, for instance, in sacrifice, what you're doing is taking the categories living and the dead and actually bringing them together by killing something which is in front of you. You're playing around with the distinctions between living and dead. And the fourth point is that in just the same way that symbolic manipulations of college colours, or the symbolic manipulation of colours by analogy, can be made to make statements in another domain. Colours can talk about colleges, so that we can manipulate the categories by bringing together or keeping separate clothing categories, food categories, animal categories, etc. We can make symbolic statements about the bringing together or separation of social categories by analogy, and that's what I want to start exploring in future lectures. Thank you.